Welcome back to Read With Me series. We are starting with second chapter of 11th Standard Economic NCERT. Indian Economy 1950 to 1990. After studying this chapter, the learners will come to know the goals of India's 5-year plans, know about development policies in different sectors such as agriculture, industry from 1950 to 1990. Learn to think about the merits and limitation of regulated economy. The central objective of planning in India is to initiate a process of development which will raise the living standards and open out to the people new opportunities for a richer and more varied life. First 5-year plan. Introduction. On 15 August 1947, India woke to a new dawn of freedom. Finally, we were masters of our own destiny. After some 200 years of British rule, the job of nation building was now in our own hands. The leaders of independent India had to decide among other things, the type of economic system most suitable for our nation, a system which would promote the welfare of all rather than a few. There are different types of economic systems, and among them, socialism appealed to Jawaharlal Nehru the most. However, he was not in favor of kind of socialism established in former Soviet Union, where all the means of production, that is all the factories and farms in the country, were owned by government. There was no private property. It is not possible in democracy like India for the government to change the ownership pattern of land and other properties of its citizens in the way that it was done in the former Soviet Union. Nehru and many other leaders and thinkers of the newly independent India sought an alternative to extreme versions of capitalism and socialism. Basically, sympathizing with socialist outlook, they found the answer in an economic system which in their view combined the best features of socialism without its drawbacks. In this view, India would be socialist society with a strong public sector but also with private property and democracy. The government would plan further economy with the private sector being encouraged to the part of a plan effort. The industrial policy resolution of 1948 and directive principles of the Indian Constitution reflected this outlook. In 1950, the Planning Commission was set up with the Prime Minister as its chairperson. The era of 5-year plans had begun. Okay? So before getting into it, we'll just see these boxes. Types of economic systems. Every society has to answer 3 questions. What goods and services should we produce in the country? How should the goods and services be produced? Should producers use more human labor or more capital for producing things? How should the goods and services be distributed among people? One answer to this question is to depend on market forces of supply and demand. In a market economy, also called capitalism, only those consumers' goods will be produced that are in demand. Goods that can be sold profitably either in domestic or foreign markets. If cars are in demand, cars will be produced, and if bicycles are in demand, bicycles will be produced. If labor is cheaper than capital, more labor-intensive methods of production will be used, and vice versa. In a capitalist society, the goods produced are distributed among people not on the basis of what people need, but on the basis of what people can afford and are willing to purchase. This means that A sick person will be able to use the required medicine only if he or she can afford to buy it. If they cannot afford the medicine, they will not be able to use it even if they need it urgently. Such a society did not appeal to Jawaharlal Nehru, our first Prime Minister. For it meant that the great majority of people of the country would be left behind without a chance to improve their quality of life. A socialist. A socialist society answers the three questions in a totally different manner. In a socialist society, the government decides what goods are to be produced in accordance with the needs of society. It is assumed that the government knows what is good for the people of country, and so the desires of individual consumers are not given much importance. The government decides how goods are to be produced and how they should be distributed. In principle, distribution under socialism is supposed to be based on what people need and not on what they can afford. Unlike under capitalism, for example, a socialist nation provides free health care to citizens who need it. Strictly, a socialist society has no private property since everything is owned by the state. With the collapse of Soviet system in the last decade of 20th century, socialist economies in the former Soviet Union and the socialist state in Eastern Europe ceased to exist. Most economies are mixed economies. That is, the government and the market together answer the three questions of what to produce, how to produce, and how to distribute what is produced. In a mixed economy, the market will provide whatever goods and services it can produce well, and the government will produce essential goods and services which the market fails to do. So now we understand what is a plan. A plan spells out how the resource of a nation should be put to use. It should have some general goal as well as specific objective which are to be achieved within a specified period of time. In India, plans are of 5 years duration and are called 5-year plan. We borrowed this from former Soviet Union, a pioneer in national planning. Our plan documents not only specify the objectives to be attained in 5 years of a plan, but also what is to be achieved over a period of 20 years. This long-term plan is called perspective plan. The 5-year plan are supposed to provide the basis for the perspective plan. It will be unrealistic to expect all the goals of a plan to be given equal importance in all the plans. In fact, the goal may actually be in conflict. For example, the goal of introducing modern technology may be in conflict with the goal of increasing employment. If a technology reduces the need for labor, the planners have to balance the goal, a very difficult job indeed. We find different goals being emphasized in different plans in India. Our 5-year plans do not spell out how much of each and every good and service is to be produced. This is neither possible nor necessary. The former Soviet Union tried to do this and failed. It is enough if the plan is specific about the sector where it plays a commanding role. For instance, power generation and irrigation, while leaving the rest to the market. Now we'll see this. The goal of 5-year plans. A plan should have some clearly specified goals. The goal of 5-year plans are growth, modernization, self-reliance, and equity. 4 pillars. That is growth, modernization, self-reliance, and equity. This does not mean that all the plans have given equal importance to all these goals. Due to limited resources, a choice has to be made in each plan about which of the goal is to be given primary importance. Nevertheless, the planners have to ensure that As far as possible, the policies of the plan do not contradict these four goals. Let us now learn about the goal of planning in some detail. Growth. It refers to increase in the country's capacity to produce the output of goods and services within a country. It implies either a larger stock of productive capital or a larger size of supporting services like transport and banking, or an increase in the efficiency of productive capital and services. A good indicator of economic growth. In a language of economics, is steady increase in the gross domestic product. The GDP is the market value of all the goods and services produced in a country during a year. You can think of GDP as cake. Growth is increase in the size of cake. If the cake is larger, more people can enjoy it. It is necessary to produce more goods and services of a people of India if the people of India are to enjoy, in the words of the 5-year plans, a more rich and varied life. The GDP of country is derived from the different sectors of the economy, namely the agriculture sector, industrial sector and service sector. The contribution made by each of these sectors makes up the structural composition of the economy. In some countries, growth in agriculture contributes more to the GDP growth, while in some countries the growth in the service sector contributes more to the GDP growth. Modernization. To increase the production of goods and services, the producers have to adopt new technology. For example, a farmer can increase the output on the farm by using new seed varieties instead of using the old ones. Similarly, factory can increase output by using a new type of machine. Adaptation of new technology is called modernization. However, modernization does not refer only to the use of new technology but also to changes in social outlook, such as recognition that women should have the same right as men. In traditional society, women are supposed to remain at home while men work. Modern society makes use of talent of women in the workplace, in banks, factories, schools, etc. And such a society will be more civilized and prosperous. Self-reliance. A nation can promote economic growth and modernization by using its own resources or by using resources imported from other nations. The first 7 5-year plans gave importance to self-reliance, which means avoiding imports of those goods which could be produced in India itself. This policy was considered a necessity in order to reduce our dependence on foreign countries, especially for food. It is understandable that people who were recently freed from foreign domination should give importance to self-reliance. Further, it was feared that dependence on imported goods supplies, food supplies, foreign technology and foreign capital may make India's sovereignty vulnerable to foreign interference in our policies. Equity. Now, growth, modernization and self-reliance by themselves may not improve the kind of life which people are living. A country can have high growth, the most modern technology developed in the country itself, and also have most of the people living in poverty. It is important to ensure that the benefits of economic prosperity reach the poor section as well, instead of being enjoyed only by the rich. So, in addition to growth, modernization and self-reliance, equity is also important. Every Indian should be able to meet his or her basic needs such as food, a decent house, education and health care, and inequality in the distribution of wealth should be reduced. Let us now see how the first 7 5-year plans covering the period of 1950 to 1990 attempted to attain these 4 goals and the extent to which they succeeded in doing so. With reference to agriculture, industry and trade, you will study the policies and development issues taken up after 1991 in chapter 3. Before continuing, we'll just have a look into tables. Yes, this is the one. Mahalanobis, the architect of Indian planning. Many distinguished thinkers contributed to formulation of 5-year plans. Among them, the name of a statistician, Prasanta Chandra Mahalanobis, stands out. Planning in the real sense of terms began with the second 5-year plan. The second plan, a landmark contribution to development planning in general, laid down the basic ideas regarding goals of India planning. This plan was based on the idea of Mahalanobis. In that sense, he can be regarded as the architect of Indian planning. Mahalanobis was born in 1893 in Calcutta. He was educated at a Presidency College in Calcutta and at Cambridge University in England. His contribution to the subject of statistics brought him international fame. In 1946, he was made a Fellow of Britain's Royal Society, one of the most prestigious organizations of scientists. Only the most outstanding scientists are made members of this society. Mahalanobis established the Indian Statistical Institute in Calcutta and started a journal, Sankhya, which still serves as a respected forum for statisticians to discuss their ideas. Both the ISI and Sankhya are highly regarded by statisticians and economists all over the world to this day. During the second plan period, Mahalanobis invited many distinguished economists from India and abroad to advise him on India's economic development. Some of these economists became Nobel Prize winners later, which shows that he could identify individuals with talent. Among the economists invited by Mahalanobis were those who were very critical of the socialist principle of second plan. In other words, he was willing to listen to what his critics had to say, the mark of great scholar. Many economists today reject the approaches to planning formulated by Mahalanobis, but he will always be remembered for playing a vital role in putting India on the road to economic progress, and statisticians continue to profit from the contribution to statistical theory. Source: Sankhyomi, Chakravarti, Mahalanobis, Prasanta Chandra. So second table is about the service sector. As a country develops, it undergoes structural change. In the case of India, structural change is peculiar. Usually, with development, the share of agriculture declines and the share of industry becomes dominant. At higher level of development, the service sector contributes more to the GDP than the other two sectors. In India, the share of agriculture in the GDP was more than 50%, as we would expect for a poor country. But by 1990s, the share of the service sector was 40.59%, more than that of agriculture or industry, like what we find in developed nations. This phenomenon of growing share of the service sector was accelerated in the post-1991 period. This marked the onset of globalization in country, which will be discussed in subsequent chapter. Yes. Now we can start with agriculture. You have learnt in chapter 1 that during colonial rule, there was neither growth nor equity in the agriculture sector. The policy makers of independent India had to address these issues, which they did through land reforms and promoting the use of miracle seeds, which ushered in a revolution in Indian agriculture. Land reforms. At the time of independence, the land tenure system was characterized by intermediaries, variously called zamindars, zagidars, etc., who merely collected rent from the actual tillers of the soil without contributing towards improvement on the farm. The low productivity of the agricultural sector forced India to import food from United States of America. Equity in agriculture called for land reforms, which primarily referred to change in the ownership of land holdings. Just a year after independence, steps were taken to abolish the intermediaries and to make the tillers the owners of a land. The idea behind this move was that ownership of land would give incentives, see the box 2.5, to the tillers to invest in making improvements provided sufficient capital was made available to them. Land ceiling was another policy to promote equity in the agricultural sector. This means fixing the maximum size of land which could be owned by an individual. The purpose of land ceiling was to reduce the concentration of land ownership in few hands. The abolition of intermediaries meant that some 200 lakh tenants came into direct contact with the government. They were thus freed from being exploited by the zamindars. The ownership conferred on tenants gave them the incentive to increase output, and this contribution contributed to growth in agriculture. However, the goal of equity was not fully served by abolition of intermediaries. In some areas, the former zamindars continued to own large areas of land by making use of some loopholes in the legislation. There were cases where tenants were evicted and the landowners claimed to be self-cultivators, the actual tillers claiming ownership of the land. And even when the tillers got ownership of a land, the poorest of the agricultural laborers such as the sharecroppers and landless laborers did not benefit from land reforms. The land ceiling legislation also faced hurdles. The big landlords challenged the legislation in the court, delaying the implementation. They used this delay to register their lands in the name of close relatives, thereby escaping from legislation. The legislation also had a lot of loopholes which were exploited by the big landlords or landholders to retain their land. Land reforms were successful in Kerala and West Bengal because these states had government committed to policy of land to the tiller. Unfortunately, other states did not have the same level of commitment, and vast inequality in land holding continues this day. The Green Revolution. At independence, about 75% of the country's population was dependent on agriculture. Productivity in the agriculture sector was very low because of the use of old technology and the absence of required infrastructure for the vast majority of farmers. India's agriculture vitally depends on the monsoon, and if the monsoon fell short, the farmers were in trouble unless they had access to irrigation facility, which very few had. The stagnation in agriculture during the colonial rule was permanently broken by the Green Revolution. This refers to the large increase in the production of food grains resulting from the use of high-yielding variety HYV seeds, especially for wheat and rice. The use of these seeds required the use of fertilizers and pesticides in correct quantities as well as regular supply of water. The need for these inputs in correct proportion is vital. The farmers who could benefit from HYV seeds required reliable irrigation facilities as well as the financial resources to purchase fertilizers and pesticides. As a result, in first phase of Green Revolution, approximately mid-1960s up to mid-1970s, the use of HYV seeds was restricted to the more affluent states such as Punjab, Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu. Further, the use of HYV seeds primarily benefited the wheat growing regions only. In the second phase of the Green Revolution, mid-1970s and 1980s, the HYV technology spread to larger number of states and benefited more variety of crops. The spread of Green Revolution technology enabled India to achieve self-sufficiency in food grains. We no longer had to be at the mercy of America or any other nation for meeting our nation's food requirement. Growth in agricultural output is important, but it is not enough. If a large proportion of this increase is consumed by the farmer themselves instead of being sold in markets, the higher output will not make much of a difference to the economy as whole. If, on the other hand, a substantial amount of agricultural produce is sold in the market by the farmers, the higher output can make a difference to the country's economy. The portion of agricultural produce which is sold in market by the farmers is called marketed surplus. Fortunately, as pointed out by the famous economist C.H. Hanumanta Rao, a good proportion of the rice and wheat produced during the Green Revolution period, available as marketed surplus, was sold by the farmers in the market. As a result, the price of food grains declined relative to other items of consumption. The low-income groups who spent a large percentage of their income on food benefited from this decline in relative prices. The Green Revolution enabled the government to procure sufficient amount of food grains to build a stock which could be used in times of food shortage. While the nation had immensely benefited from a Green Revolution technology, the technology involved was not free from risk. One such risk was the possibility that it would increase the disparities between small and big farmers. Since only a big farmers could afford the required input, thereby reaping most of the benefits of a Green Revolution. Moreover, the HIV seeds or HIV crops were also more prone to attack by pests, and the small farmers who adopted this technology could lose everything in a pest attack. Fortunately, these fears did not come true because of steps taken by the government. The government provided loans at a low interest rate to small farmers and subsidized fertilizer so that small farmers could also have access to the needed inputs. Since the small farmers could obtain the required input, the output on small farmers equaled the output on large farms in course of time. As a result, the Green Revolution benefited the small as well as rich farmers. The risk of small farmers being ruined when pests attacked their crops was considerably reduced by the services rendered by research institute established by the government. You should note that the Green Revolution would have favored the rich farmers only if the state did not play an extensive role in ensuring that small farmers also gains from new technology. The debate over subsidies. The economic justification of subsidies in agriculture is, at present, a hotly debated question. It is generally agreed that it was necessary to use subsidies to provide an incentive for adoption of new HIV technology by farmers in general and small farmers in particular. Any new technology will be looked upon as being risky by farmers. Subsidies were therefore needed to encourage farmers to test the new technology. Some economists believe that once the technology is found profitable and is widely adopted, subsidies should be phased out since their purpose has been served. Further, subsidies are meant to benefit the farmer, but a substantial amount of fertilizer subsidy also benefited the fertilizer industry. And among farmers, the subsidy largely benefit the farmers in a more prosperous region. Therefore, it is argued that there is no case for continuing with fertilizer subsidy. It does not benefit the target group and it is a huge burden on government's finance. On the other hand, some believe that the government should continue with agricultural subsidies because farming in India continues to be a risky business. Most farmers are very poor and they will not be able to afford the required input without subsidies. Eliminating subsidies will increase the inequality between rich and poor farmers and violate the goal of equity. These experts argue that if subsidies are largely benefiting the fertilizer industry and big farmers, the correct policy is not abolish subsidies but to take steps to ensure that only the poor farmer enjoy the benefits. Thus, by the late 1960s, Indian agriculture productivity had increased sufficiently to enable the country to be self-sufficient in food grains. This is an achievement to be proud of. On the negative side, some 65% of the country's population continued to be employed in agriculture even as late as 1990. Economists have found that as a nation becomes more prosperous, the proportion of GDP contributed by agriculture as well as proportion of population working in the sector declines considerably. In India, between 1950 and 1990, the proportion of GDP contributed by agriculture declined significantly, but not the population depending on it. 67.5% in 1950 to 64.9% by 1990. Why was such a large proportion of population engaged in agriculture, although agricultural output could have grown with much less people working in the sector? The answer is that industrial sector and service sector did not absorb the people working in the agricultural sector. Many economists call this an important failure of our policies followed during 1950 to 1990. So now we'll continue with the tables and then come back. So service sector, we read this table and it is work it out, not required. Now we'll see about ownership and incentives. The policy of land to the tiller is based on idea that cultivators will take more interest, they will have more incentive in increasing output if they are the owners of the land. This is because ownership of a land enables the tiller to make profit from an increased output. Tenants do not have incentive to make improvements on land since it is landowner who would benefit more from higher output. The importance of ownership in providing incentive is well illustrated by the carelessness with which farmers in a former Soviet Union used to pack fruits for sale. It was not uncommon to see farmers packing rotten fruits along with fresh fruits in a same box. Now every farmer knows that the rotten fruits will spoil the fresh fruits if they are packed together. This will be loss to the farmer since the fruits cannot be sold. So why did the Soviet farmers do something which would be so obviously result in loss for them? The answer lies in the incentives facing the farmers. Since farmers in the former Soviet Union did not own any land, they neither enjoyed the profit nor suffered the losses. In the absence of ownership, there was no incentive on the part of farmers to be efficient, which also explained the poor performance of the agricultural sector in Soviet Union despite availability of vast area of highly fertile land. So the next table is prices as signals. You would have learnt in an earlier class about how prices of a goods are determined in market. It is important to understand that prices are signals about availability of a goods. If a good becomes scarce, its price will rise, and those who use these goods will have to incentive to make efficient decisions about its use based on the price. If the price of a water goes up because of lower supply, people will have to incentive to use it with a greater care. For example, they may stop watering for garden to conserve water. We complain whenever the price of a petrol increases and blame it on the government. But the increase in the petrol price reflects greater scarcity, and the price rise is signal that less petrol is available. This provides an incentive to use less petrol or look for alternative fuel. Some economists point out that subsidies do not allow prices to indicate the supply of a good. When electricity and water are provided at a subsidized rate or a free, they will be used wastefully without any concern for their scarcity. Farmers will cultivate water incentive crops if water is supplied free. Although the water resource in that region may be scarce, and such crops will further deplete the already scarce resource. If water is priced to reflect scarcity, farmers will cultivate crops suitable to the region. Fertilizer and pesticide subsidies result in overuse of resources which can be harmful to the environment. Subsidies provide an incentive for wasteful use of resources. Think about subsidies in terms of incentives and ask yourself whether it is a wise from economic viewpoint to provide free electricity to farmers. Yeah, now next one is industry and trade. Economists have found that poor nations can progress only if they have a good industrial sector. Industry provides employment which is more stable than the employment in agriculture. It promotes modernization and overall prosperity. It is for this reason that 5-year plans place a lot of emphasis on industrial development. You might have studied in a previous chapter that at the time of independence the variety of industries was very narrow, largely confined to cotton, textile and jute. There were two well-managed iron and steel firms, one in Jamshedpur and other in Kolkata. But obviously, we needed to expand the industrial base with a variety of industries if the economy was to grow. Market and state in Indian industrial development. The big question facing the policymaker was what should be the role of the government and the private sector in industrial development. At the time of independence, Indian industrialists did not have the capital to undertake investment in industrial ventures required for development of a economy, nor was the market big enough to encourage industrialists to undertake major projects even if they had the capital to do so. It is principally for these reasons that the state had to play an extensive role in promoting industrial sector. In addition, the decision to develop the Indian economy on socialist lines led to the policy of state controlling the commanding heights of an economy. As the second 5-year plan put it, this meant that the state would have complete control of those industries that were vital for the economy. The policies of private sector would have to be complementary to those of public sector, with the public sector leading the way. Industrial Policy Resolution 1956, IPR 1956. In accordance with the goal of the state controlling the commanding heights of an economy, the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1956 was adopted. This resolution formed the basis of the second 5-year plan, the plan which tried to build the basis for socialist pattern of society. This resolution classified industries into 3 categories. The first category comprised industries which would be exclusively owned by state. The second category consists of industries in which the private sector could supplement the effort of state sector, with the state taking the sole responsibility for starting new units. The third category consisted of remaining industries which were to be in private sector. Although there was a category of industries left to the private sector, the sector was kept under state control through a system of license. No new industry was allowed unless a license was obtained from a government. This policy was used for promoting industries in backward regions. It was easier to obtain a license of the industrial unit was established in an economically backward areas. In addition, such units were given certain concessions such as tax benefits and electricity at lower tariff. The purpose of this policy was to promote regional equality. Even an existing industry had to obtain a license for expanding output or for diversifying production, producing a new variety of goods. This was meant to ensure that the quantity of goods produced was not more than what the economy requires. License to expand production was given only if the government was convinced that the economy requires a larger quantity of goods. Small scale industry. In 1955, the Village and Small Scale Industries Committee, called the Carvey Committee, noted the possibility of using small Scale industry is defined with reference to the maximum investment allowed on the asset of a unit. This limit was changed over a period of time. In 1950, a small scale industry unit was one which invested a maximum of rupee 5 lakh. At present, the maximum investment allowed is rupees 1 crore. It was believed that small scale industries are more labor intensive, that is, they use more labor than the large scale industries and therefore generate more employment. But these industries cannot compete with the big industrial firms. It is obvious that development of small scale industry requires them to be shielded from a large firms. For this purpose, the production of number of products was reserved for the small scale industry. The criteria of reservation being the ability of these units to manufacture the goods. They were also given consensus such as lower excise duty and bank loans at lower interest rates. Trade policy, import substitution. The industrial policy that were adopted was closely related to the trade policy. In the first 7 plans, trade was characterized by what is commonly called an inward-looking trade strategy. Technically, the strategy is called import substitution. This policy aimed at replacing or substituting imports with domestic production. For example, instead of importing vehicles made in foreign country, industries would be encouraged to produce them in India itself. In this policy, the government protected the domestic industries from foreign competition. Protection from imports took 2 forms: tariff and quotas. Tariff are a tax on imported goods. They make imported goods more expensive and discourage their use. Quota specify the quantity of goods which can be imported. The effect of tariff and quota is that they restrict import and therefore protect the domestic firms from foreign competition. The policy of protection is based on the notion that industries of a developing countries are not in a position to compete against the goods produced by other developed economies. It is assumed that if the domestic industries are protected, they will learn to compete in the course of time. Our planners also feared that possibility of foreign exchange being spent on import of luxury goods if no restrictions were placed on imports. Nor was any serious thought given to promote export until the mid-1980s. Effect of policies on industrial development. The achievements of India's industrial sector during the first 7 plans are impressive indeed. The proportion of GDP contributed by the industrial sector increased in the period from 11.8% in 1950-51 to 24.6% in 1990-91. The rise in the industrial share of GDP is an important indicator of development. The 6% annual growth rate of industrial sector during the period is commendable. No longer was Indian industries restricted largely to cotton, textile and jute. In fact, the industrial sector became well diversified by 1990, largely due to public sector. The promotion of small-scale industries gave opportunity to those people who did not have the capital to start large firms to get into business. Protection from foreign competition enabled the development of indigenous industries in the areas of electronics and automobiles sector, which otherwise could not have developed. In spite of the contribution made by the public sector to the growth of Indian economy, some economists are critical of the performance of many public sector enterprises. It was proposed that beginning of this chapter that initially public sector was required in a big way. It is now widely held that state enterprise continue to produce certain goods and services, often monopolizing them, although this was no longer required. An example is the provision of telecommunication service. The government had the monopoly of this service even after private sector firm could also provide it. Due to the absence of competition, even till the late 1990s, one had to wait for a long time to get a telephone connection. Another instance could be the establishment of modern bread, a bread manufacturing firm. as if the private sector could not manufacture bread. In 2001, this farm was sold to private sector. The point is that no distinction was made between what the public sector alone can do and what the private sector can also do. For example, even now only the public sector can supply national defense and free medical treatment for poor patients. And even though the private sector can manage hotels well, yet the government also runs hotels. This has led some scholars to argue that the state should get out of areas which the private sector can manage and the government may concentrate its resources on important services which the private sector cannot provide. Many public sector firms incurred huge losses but continued to function because it is very difficult, almost impossible to close a government undertaking even if it is a drain on the nation's limited resource. This does not mean that private firms are always profitable. Indeed, quite a few of the public sector firms are originally private firms which were on the verge of closure due to losses. They were then nationalized to protect the jobs of the workers. However, a loss-making private firm will not waste resources by being kept running despite of losses. The need to obtain a license to start an industry was misused by industrial houses. A big industrialist would get a license not for starting a new firm but to prevent competitors from starting new firms. The excessive regulation of what came to be called the permit license Raj prevented certain firms from becoming more efficient. More time was spent by industrialists in trying to obtain a license or lobby with the concerned ministries rather than thinking about how to improve their products. The protection from foreign competition is also being criticized on the ground that it continued even after it proved to do more harm than good. Due to restrictions on imports, the Indian consumers had to purchase whatever the Indian producer produced. The producers were aware that they have captive market, so they had no incentive to improve the quality of their goods. Why should they think of improving quality when they could sell low quality items at a high price? Competition from imports forces our producers to be more efficient. Nevertheless, scholars point out that the public sector is not meant for earning profit but to promote the welfare of a nation. The public sector firm on this view should be evaluated on the basis of extent to which they contribute to the welfare of a people and not on the profit they earn. Regarding protection, some economists hold that we should protect our producers from foreign competition as long as the rich nations continue to do so. Owing to all these conflicts, economists called for a change in our policy. This, along with other problems, led the government to introduce a new economic policy in 1991. Conclusion. The progress of the Indian economy during the first 7 plans was impressive indeed. Our industries became far more diversified compared to the situation at independence. India became self-sufficient in food production thanks to the Green Revolution. Land reform resulted in abolition of the hated zamindari system. However, many economists became dissatisfied with the performance of many public sector enterprises. Excessive government regulation prevented the growth of entrepreneurship in the name of self-reliance. Our producers were protected against foreign competition and this did not give them the incentive to improve the quality of goods that they produced. Our policies were inward oriented and so we failed to develop strong export sector. The need for reform of economic policy was widely felt in the context of changing global economic scenarios, and new economic policy was initiated in 1991 to make our economy more efficient. This is the subject of the next chapter.